Most folks have a horseback concept of what electrical voltage is at 110 or at 220 volts, especially when it comes to the shock value, or that the higher voltage is used for electrical dryers and stoves and water heaters. I also would guess that the majority of us would know that BTU stands for British Thermal Units. Other than the name and that it deals with energy or heat, the rest is a great mystery, only understood by the greatest of all minds and possibly God himself. In truth, other than being involved in physics or equipment design that pushes the envelope far beyond today's understanding, a good grasp of these things for everyday use isn't that difficult, and knowing these things will help in the decision-making when purchasing appliances and equipment. So let's look under the hood of electricity and BTUs. It's not as scary as you think. Hi, I'm Scott Bain. They call me the old farmer. Whether you are planning for new appliances or managing a farm, knowing when to use 110 or 220 volts and why BTUs are worth knowing can influence your pocketbook and could make the difference in whether your farm makes a profit or not this year. AC or alternating current can be confusing. Sometimes voltages are stated as 110, 117, or 120 volts for a typical appliance or piece of equipment. The same is true for 220, 230, and 240 volts. Technically, these are different voltages, and yet they are the same. That wasn't hard to explain or understand, was it? If you're lucky enough to have a Grizzly Industrial Catalog, better known as Grizzly Tools Catalog, you will find out electricity does not stop at 220 or 240. There is 440 and even 660 volts with phases of 1 or 3-phased motors. And what about AC versus DC motors? How can anyone understand all this gobbledygook? First, let's take care of AC versus DC using water. The water coming from your faucet is DC water. It is constant with very little change in the water flow and the pressure. A pulsating water sprinkler is closer to what AC electricity is all about. It pulses positive to positive again in a continuing oscillation. The reason why we use AC electricity is that it can go vast distances where DC electricity starts having problems after a couple of city blocks. We would need a power station in every city and at a half mile apart. AC electricity can be sent around the world and back. That's why we use AC electricity. If we use DC power locally, say in a factory, the AC electricity would be changed into DC at the plant site. If we did not include time in a graphic of AC, it would be a circle. Half the time it would be positive voltage, and half the time be negative volts. When we add time into the equation, we get what is called a sine or sinusoidal wave. The peak voltage is 120 volts plus or minus 5%. There are 2 points in the center of the cycle where there is no voltage at all. In North America, this happens 120 times a second because we have 60-cycle AC. Many countries, such as Great Britain, are on the 50-cycle system, which means their zero voltage happens 100 times a second, and their standard house voltage is 230 volts. The sine wave diagram shows all the different locations where a measurement is usually obtained, and still have an accurate but different reading for the cycle. For example, the RMS is reading the equivalent power as if it was coming from a DC source. RMS means root mean square. That is the actual working power of the circuit. The average power is usually used with a time reference, meaning volts times the amount of time. An example is a kilowatt hour. Average power can be considered the amount of work that can be performed. For most folks, just consider that any voltage stated between 107 and 125 volts is the wall spigot, and it's all right to plug it into the wall. The same thing happens when you talk about 220 volts. Anything between 214 and 240 needs the plug you use for the electric dryer, electric stove, or the electric water heater. If everything is equal, if a piece of equipment or appliance uses 110 volts at 10 amps, if it can be converted to 220, your amps will go down to 5 amps. Volts times amps equals watts, or power. Now let's not confuse electrical watts with the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, James G. Watt, who served in this post from 1981 to 1983 for President Ronald Reagan. That is a completely different subject that may be discussed possibly in a future video. If the same amount of work can be done whether something runs at 220 or 110 volts, why should we choose the 220 volt option whenever possible? It has to do with how the electrical power company charges for every kilowatt hour of electricity. Most homes have 220 volts and in new homes at 200 amps. The service is based upon 220 volts or two separate 110 lines coming into your home. If a kilowatt hour costs 23 cents for 1 kilowatt hour, the usage for 1 hour will be 23 cents. If you ran your 200 amp service wide open, it would cost $11.04 an hour. So let us say your electric water heater is running on 110 volts at 30 amps. That's 3,300 watts. So if we round it up so we don't have any fractional pennies, we're talking about 79 cents an hour. But if we make it 220 or 240 volts, however you want to call it, you're dividing the workload between two electrical lines, which will cut your costs to 1/2 or to 38 cents an hour using round numbers. What does this mean? Look around and find how many pumps and motors and heavy usage electrical devices you have around your home. How many are running on 110 single line and how many are running on the dual 220 line. What you should do is anytime you replace something, see if it's worthwhile to get it in a 220 or 240 volt configuration. Often it will cost more, but the savings over time may be worth it. When the typical house was wired, the electrician balanced out the load as much as possible between the two lines. That's why sometimes when you blow a main fuse, only half of the lights go out. In other words, you pay for both sides of the 220. And in 110, you're only using one side. So if you're using both sides in a 220, that means you're not using as much amperage, and therefore your cost goes down. But check to see if your furnace, blower, motor, water pump, if you have one, and all the heavy-duty electrical usage appliances are configured for 220. It may be with the furnace motor, you can just restrap that 110 motor to be a 220 motor, which will reduce your cost of electricity for that motor by 1/2. Many of your larger tools in your garage, such as a table saw, the motor is usually strapped for 110, but can actually be restrapped to 220, and without needing an electrician. All you would need to do is add a 220 circuit breaker to your electric box to accommodate switching to 220. That should be done by an electrician. For those things that need 3 phases, it's a sloppy attempt to create 220 or 440 volt DC or direct current. You have additional lines coming in. Or nowadays, you buy an adapter that runs on a 220 volts single phase. It's a small 3-phase generator which will create 3-phase power for 1 or 2 tools at a time. It definitely cuts your efficiency of electrical usage, but it will literally save you thousands of dollars to have 3-phase or even a wire leg 3-phase into your site. Adding 3-phase power is extremely expensive and in some areas impossible to get from the power company. So they create a wire leg diode configuration that fakes the 3rd phase. Again, it's cheaper to buy the 3-phase generator. If you need such a critter for your tools, talk to the company's experts for more details and typical costs of operation for one of these 3-phase generators. Now let's get to BTUs, or British thermal units.
Oh yeah.
No, it's not a rock or punk band from England. A British thermal unit, BTU, is a measure of the heat content of fuels or energy sources. It is the quantity of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 pound of liquid water by 1 degree Fahrenheit at the temperature that water is the greatest density, which is about 39 degrees Fahrenheit. That quote is directly from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. The easiest way to explain it is that it's the result of applying some force, it could even be mechanical, that causes an actual change in temperature. So let's do it this way. Most times a light bulb brightness is given in wattage as to how much light it's giving out. This is irrelevant. It is the amount of lumens that matters. Some components in the making of lights may take twice as many watts to give the same amount of lumens that another set of components would use. So wattage is useless for how bright a light bulb is. It's the same with heaters of any kind. Wattage is not the measurement needed to know the amount of heat a heater will give. It is BTUs. Different components or fuels have different amount of BTUs stored internally. Here are some other things of interest. The joule is a derived unit of energy in the International System of Units. It's equal to the energy transferred to an object when a force of 1 Newton acts on that object in the direction of the force's motion through a distance of 1 meter. That's from Wikipedia. If you don't understand it, look at Wikipedia. Here's something else from Wikipedia. The erg is a unit of energy equal to 10 to the 7th power joules. It originated in centimeter, gram, second systems of units. It has the symbol erg. The erg is not an SI or a system of units measurement. Its name is derived from ergon, a Greek word meaning work or task. And erg is the amount of work done by a force by one dyne exerted for a distance of 1 centimeter. Again, from Wikipedia. So if you don't understand it, yell at them, not me. Let's use Hoover Dam as a small example. If we change the 9.2 trillion gallons of water that sits behind Hoover Dam to watts, and the drop of water in the faucet to BTUs, Hoover Dam could say it had 9.2 trillion watts of power. And it would, but it's only putting out 1 BTU from the faucet. So we need to change the way we look and define those things we use when determining output. For example, quite often electric motors are rated in horsepower. It's all right to do so conversationally. An internal combustion engine that runs at 120 horsepower can be replaced with an electric motor of 90 horsepower. But we're talking apples to oranges. An electric motor should be stated in foot-pounds to be accurate. So let's just finish up by saying that light should be stated in lumens, not watts. Heaters should be stated in BTUs, not watts, or other fuel capacities. And electric motors should be stated in foot-pounds, not horsepower. I hope this is giving you a taste of how impressive something may be if stated in the wrong measure. So if you don't know what the unit should be for something, look it up before you buy. Also, make sure that the manufacturer didn't do a mathematical conversion to arrive at the specific rating. So if a 15,000 watt heater says it puts out 51,182.124495 BTUs, chances are very strong that the company took the input power and converted it to BTUs. There's a resistiveness to the elements that are involved that will use energy by maybe a small percentage amount. So the number should be less than 51,182.124495. So at 95% efficiency, which is more likely, the BTU should be just under 49,000 BTUs. It might be a wise decision to call a manufacturer and ask what the actual BTUs that are coming out of that particular heater that you're looking at. Whatever it is, the number should be less than 51,182.124495 BTUs. We're doing pretty good for a fairly new channel that's not stooping to using gimmicks or using fakery to pull in viewers. I've said it before. The loyalty expressed by the subscribers to this channel humbles the dickens out of this old farm boy. Thank you so very much. And if you're just dropping by for the first time, nice to meet you. Drop by again if you're in the area. And if you like what you see, you're invited to subscribe and do all the YouTube things that YouTube wants you to do. Well, this is the old farmer, Scott Bain. Be well. Be safe.
Don't forget to click like and click subscribe on the Old Farmer YouTube channel. And thanks again for watching. Bye.
The VFW National Home for Children, providing families of veterans and active duty military opportunities for growth and development in a nurturing community. Please consider a donation to help their children and families. I.C. Rhodes speaking.